The entire cafeteria went dead silent when Sergeant First Class Marcus Holt picked up his tray and dumped it. Every last drop of gravy, every scoop of mashed potatoes, every splash of black coffee directly onto the nurse standing in front of him. It hit her chest, her shoulders, her face. The coffee was still hot. It soaked through the front of her scrubs in seconds, dark and spreading, and the sound of the tray hitting the floor rang out across a room that had gone completely, unnaturally still. 50 soldiers watched. 50 people who had seen hard things, who had been trained to operate in chaos, who did not rattle easily, and every single one of them held their breath. They waited for tears. They waited for her to step back, to bring her hands up, to make the sound people make when something unexpected and humiliating happens to them in public. They waited for her to break in some small, visible way that would make the moment manageable for everyone present. She didn't move. She stood completely still, her arms at her sides, coffee dripping off the hem of her scrubs onto the cafeteria floor, and she let the silence build until it had weight, until every person in that room could feel it pressing against their chest. And then she looked up at him, not past him, not away from him, at him, level and steady, and without a single thing in her expression that resembled fear. And she said 2 words that nobody in that room would forget for the rest of their time at Harlow Ridge. Remember this. Before we go any further, if you found this channel today, hit subscribe right now, because stories like this one are exactly what we do here, and I don't want you to miss what's coming. This is where the women everyone underestimated finally get their moment on record. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and leave me a comment. Tell me what city you're watching from. What country? Because I genuinely want to see how far this story reaches. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that cafeteria and what happened in the weeks that followed, you need to understand who Claire Novak actually was. Not who she appeared to be, not the version of her that Harlow Ridge had decided to see, who she actually was, and why every person who tried to remove her from that building had no idea, not even a small idea, of what they were standing in front of. Harlow Ridge Military Medical Center occupied the eastern edge of a high-altitude plain in western Wyoming, built into the landscape with the no-nonsense practicality of a structure designed entirely around function. There was no attempt at aesthetics. Concrete block buildings arranged in a grid, chain link fencing along the perimeter, a main access road that stretched straight and flat toward the highway for nearly 2 miles before it reached anything resembling a town. In summer, the plain was dry and wind-scoured. In winter, the cold came in off the mountains to the west with a consistency that felt personal, settling into the walls of the buildings and the joints of the people who worked inside them. The nearest grocery store was 40 minutes south. The nearest city was 3 hours east. People who came to Harlow Ridge either adjusted to the isolation or they didn't last, and the ones who lasted stopped noticing it after the first year. Claire Novak had been on staff at Harlow Ridge for 14 months. She was 33 years old, medium height, lean in the way that comes from staying active rather than trying. With dark brown hair, she pulled back into a bun every morning that reliably came half loose by the end of a long shift. There was a scar on the left side of her jaw, pale, clean, maybe 2 inches long, the kind that had healed professionally a long time ago, and she never mentioned it. And people stopped asking after the first month. She wore her badge clipped to the left breast pocket of her scrubs at the same angle every single day. She arrived between 620 and 640 depending on traffic, which on the base's access road meant nothing was ever actually wrong, just variable. She left late consistently rarely before her shift ended on paper, often an hour or more after. She ate in the cafeteria alone, or at her desk, or sometimes not at all. In team meetings, she listened without performing the act of listening, and when asked direct questions, she gave direct answers that were never wrong and never wasted a syllable. She kept the supply room organized to a standard that made new staff feel they'd missed a memo. She tracked pharmaceutical inventory with a precision that the outgoing supply coordinator had described in his handover notes as, quote, somewhat intense. Nobody at Harlow Ridge found any of this particularly interesting. That was the specific and useful way that military medical centers worked, at least the ones that had been running long enough to develop their own internal gravity. After enough personnel rotations, enough familiar institutional rhythms, enough of the same hallways and the same procedures and the same hierarchy reasserting itself with every new intake of staff, people stopped looking at each other with any real curiosity. You saw what someone's role told you to see. Claire's role told people she was a competent civilian supply nurse who cared too much about inventory and not enough about being noticed, and that was the version of her they kept. The version they kept was not the whole story, but nobody was asking for the whole story. Sergeant First Class Marcus Holt arrived at Harlow Ridge on a 60-day command rotation in the second week of January. He came from a combat support unit based out of a southwestern installation, and he brought with him the particular energy of a man who had operated at a certain level of authority long enough that adjusting downward, even temporarily, required more effort than he usually bothered to spend. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped graying hair and a jaw that appeared to be in a state of permanent mild tension. He moved through spaces the way some senior NCOs do, not aggressive exactly, but with a constant low-frequency assertion of presence, a kind of atmospheric claim on whatever room he walked into. His soldiers worked efficiently for him because they had done the math early and determined that resistance cost more than compliance. He was not deliberately cruel. He was a man with a deeply settled hierarchy in his head and very little appetite for information that contradicted it. His views on civilian nursing staff, embedded in military medical environments, were consistent and vocal. You want to know what the fundamental problem with this facility is. He was standing in the hallway, directly outside the supply room, during his third week, talking to two of his NCOs at a volume that was either oblivious or intentional, and Claire, working inside, could hear every word clearly. People they've got in here have never been in a situation with real stakes. They went to school, they got their certification, somebody put a badge on them and told them they were part of the mission. But they've never had to make a decision under pressure. They've never had the floor drop out. They're managing spreadsheets and calling it service. One of the NCOs had looked toward the supply room door. Sergeant, I'm still talking. You want a medical unit that holds together when it actually matters. You need people who've been tested, not someone who learned everything from a manual and thinks filing a tidy report is equivalent to doing the real work. Claire had been reconciling a controlled substance count. She noted the discrepancy. She'd found a small one, a familiar one, the latest in a sequence she'd been tracking, and kept going. She filed his name in the part of her mind she reserved for things that needed monitoring and moved on. The second incident happened during a Thursday morning trauma protocol briefing. The chief nursing officer, Diane Marsh, measured, experienced, the kind of administrator who had long since stopped being surprised by institutional politics, but hadn't stopped caring about outcomes, had asked Claire to present the updated mass casualty supply protocol she'd developed. Claire had stood at the front of the room and walked through it in 11 minutes. Protocol restructured preoperative supply staging in a way that cut average trauma preparation time by 4 minutes across a standard mass casualty intake, which in practice meant that in certain situations, the difference was measurable in outcomes rather than just process metrics. She presented it without preamble and without unnecessary qualification and sat back down. Holt had been in the back row. When she finished, he'd leaned sideways towards NCO beside him and said something that she couldn't make out from the front of the room. Both men had laughed. Diane had not reacted visibly. She had moved the briefing forward. Claire had noted it and moved on. The pharmacy corridor incident was the third and most deliberate. Holt had been coming from the administrative wing when Claire came through with a medication cart, and he'd stopped in the center of the corridor with the body language of a man who had decided this was a moment he wanted to have. He'd looked at her badge, then at her, with the specific expression of someone who has already concluded what you are, and found the conclusion dismissible. Novak. Flat like reading a label. Supply rotation. Among other responsibilities, she said. Right. He let the word sit between them. Doing work. You planning to write me another one of your little discrepancy reports? Or are you going to invest some of that energy into understanding how a real operational medical unit actually functions? The corpsman seated at the pharmacy desk had discovered urgent interest in his own paperwork. Claire looked at Holt without adjusting her expression. The variance report I submitted last week identified an 11.3% allocation gap in trauma-grade consumable supplies over a 6-week period. If you'd like to review the supporting data together, I can make time in my schedule this week. She paused, one measured beat. Sergeant. She moved the cart forward without waiting for a response. The response didn't come immediately. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough for to hear it behind her, the absence of the quick comeback he would normally have ready. That gap bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately name. And she knew that because she'd created that specific kind of silence before, in places and situations she no longer discussed with anyone at Harlow Ridge. Cafeteria incident was a Tuesday, in early March, 7:15 in the morning. The breakfast crowd was at its peak trays, sliding along the rails, voices layered over each other, combined smell of powdered eggs and institutional coffee filling a space that was too small and too loud for the number of people moving through it. Claire had just come off overnight coverage. She'd been on shift since 1900 the previous evening, filling a staffing gap that had opened up when 2 nurses called out sick within 4 hours of each other. She had logged 12 hours of patient contact and shift documentation. She had slept approximately 90 minutes in a chair in the break room at 300 and been awake since 430. She was at the end of the food line with a tray in her hands, reaching for a coffee cup with the specific economy of movement that comes from being very tired and very focused on the next task. She heard Holt before she registered him. His voice Holt carrying from somewhere to her left, mid-sentence in a conversation with someone behind him, his attention fully committed to whatever he was saying. His tray connected with hers at the edge, a glancing angle that was enough, and in the narrow window maybe a quarter of a second before the physics resolved themselves. Claire saw clearly what was going to happen. She could have stepped aside. She made the choice not to. The tray went over. Coffee first, still hot, across her left shoulder and down the front of her scrubs in a wide, dark stain. Then the eggs, the gravy, the orange juice, all of it in a single cascading mess that soaked through the fabric of her uniform and collected in a spreading pool on the floor around her feet. The sound of the tray hitting the floor rang out sharp and flat, and that sound was the last noise in the room. For a full several seconds, 50 people stopped. Not the way people stop when they're gradually distracted, the immediate, complete stop of a room that has just witnessed something cross a specific line. A nurse in soaked scrubs, a sergeant standing over her, a food tray on the floor. Everyone in that cafeteria could read the scene. Some of them had been present for earlier incidents. All of them understood the social architecture of what they were looking at. Holt looked at her. She could see the calculation moving across his face, a half-second decision tree. Whether to repair this or claim it. He chose the version he thought was strength. "Watch where you're standing," he said. Claire did not step back. She did not bring her hands up toward her face in the automatic way people do when they've been hit with something unexpected. She did not look down at herself or at the floor or at any point away from him. She stood with her arms loose at her sides, coffee still dripping off her scrubs, in a slow, steady rhythm onto the floor, and she looked at him with the full, unblinking steadiness of someone who had been in situations where losing composure had actual, irreversible consequences, and who had been thoroughly trained out of that reflex. She looked at him for long enough that the room understood she was the one deciding when this moment ended. "Remember this," she said, not loud. not theatrical. 2 words were delivered at ordinary conversational volume, which somehow made them carry further than shouting would have. The people closest heard them clearly. Those people told the people who hadn't heard, and within an hour the exact phrasing had made its way to every corner of Harlow Ridge Medical Center. She set her tray on the counter to her left. She walked out of the cafeteria. The room stayed silent for 4 full seconds after the door closed behind her. In a cafeteria with 50 people, 4 seconds of complete silence is not a small thing. It's enough time for every person present to make a decision about what they just witnessed and whose side of it they're standing on. In the staff locker room, off the main nursing corridor, Claire peeled the soaked scrubs away from her skin and pulled the backup set from the top shelf of her locker. She had kept one there since her 3rd week on staff. Old habit, kind you maintain without thinking about where it came from. She stood at the sink and ran cold water over the inside of both wrists, watching it run over her hands and down the drain. 30 seconds. It was a method for dropping heart rate quickly without any visible evidence that your heart rate needed, dropping no shaking hands, no change in breathing pattern, no visible tension anywhere a person looking at you could find and use. She had learned it during a period of her life she had no plans to discuss with anyone at Harlow Ridge. She wasn't distressed. That was the thing worth understanding about what happened at the sink that morning. She wasn't managing herself back from the edge of something. She was thinking, and she needed to think clearly, and the water helped. She was thinking about the pharmaceutical receiving log from the previous Thursday, a supervisor's signature on a batch transfer that had moved supplies from primary to secondary. Standard enough on paper, except that Claire had been in secondary storage that morning, and the transferred supplies were not there. She was thinking about the access log discrepancy from 3 weeks earlier, the one logged under her card ID, at 340 for a sector she hadn't entered, the one the IT office had attributed to a system error without apparent curiosity. She was thinking about a name she had circled twice in her notebook. Tom Yarrow, logistics coordinator, whose signature had appeared on 3 separate receiving documents for supply shipments that had subsequently vanished from physical inventory. She changed her badge, clipped it at the same angle, straightened it once. She walked back to the supply room. Supply room at Harlow Ridge was a long, narrow space that smelled like antiseptic and cardboard, lined floor-to-ceilings on both sides, with labeled metal shelving. Claire had reorganized the entire room in her first week on staff, a process that had taken most of 3 days and had generated precisely 0 complaints because nobody who wasn't directly responsible for the supply room had particularly strong feelings about how it was organized. She had installed a color-coded labeling system, a physical cross-reference log alongside the digital one, and a habit of doing a partial manual count every 3rd shift that was hers and not anyone else's responsibility. The physical log was a plain black notebook she kept in the bottom drawer of the supply desk. She had started it in her 4th week at Harlow Ridge. It now contained 14 weeks of documented discrepancies. They'd started small. A shipment of high-grade wound closure supplies, logged as received but missing from the physical shelves. Controlled substance count that balanced on paper only if you executed a specific sequence of data entries that corresponded to no standard auditing procedure she had ever been trained in, which meant whoever was doing it had access to the system. Architecture at an administrative level, not a clerical one. Trauma-grade equipment kit logged as expired and disposed of on a date that fell 4 days after Claire had personally inventoried it and confirmed it as fully operational and within date. Individually, each of these was the kind of error that happened in busy medical facilities. Supply chains had gaps. Tired people made data entry mistakes. Things were miscounted and occasionally misplaced in large inventory environments. Any one of these entries, examined alone, was a flag worth raising through normal channels and then accepting the administrative explanation for. They weren't alone. And they hadn't happened randomly. Pattern was architectural. Discrepancies staggered at irregular intervals, close enough together to serve the operation, but far enough apart to stay beneath the automatic audit trigger thresholds. Supply categories rotated so that no single category showed a trend line obvious enough to surface in a standard review. Documentation trails that were each individually plausible and in aggregate formed an impossibility, because if you laid the timelines across each other, the same physical supplies could not have been in the locations they were documented to be in at the same points in time. Someone had designed this, not someone who'd improvised a shortcut and gotten lucky. Someone with deep, working knowledge of the facility's supply management systems, audit cycles, documentation protocols, and physical layout. Someone with administrative access, physical access, and to move supplies system, the authority to move supplies through the system without triggering a secondary verification requirement. That combination of factors didn't describe many people at Harlow Ridge. Claire had spent 11 weeks identifying which people it did describe. She had not yet taken what she had to anyone inside the base, because what she had, assembled and examined in the right sequence, would survive scrutiny. But handed to the wrong person, or too early, or without the final connective element that turned a pattern into a provable chain, it could be absorbed, explained, redistributed into the institutional background noise until it disappeared. She had seen that happen before, in a different context, under different operational parameters, and the lesson had been unambiguous. You built the full case before you moved, not part of it. All of it. 3 days before the cafeteria incident, she'd confirmed she was under surveillance. Small signals, separately dismissible, collectively unambiguous. A drawer in the supply room she was certain she had closed, left open 2 inches. Her physical notebook moved from the bottom of a stack of reference materials to the middle, replaced quickly by someone who hadn't precisely matched the original position. Keycard's access error, logged under her credentials, at a time and location that served no purpose in any legitimate scenario. She hadn't pushed back on the IT explanation. She'd moved her notebook home that night, started keeping her documentation photographs on a device that never connected to the base's network, and began paying closer attention to who was paying attention to her. The morning after the cafeteria, she arrived at 645 to find a formal workplace conduct review waiting in her personnel record. She read it in Diane Marsh's office. 3 pages, careful language, institutional framing. Phrases like failure to maintain cooperative working relationships with rotating command personnel and pattern of disruptive conduct negatively impacting operational cohesion. The filing party was Sergeant First Class Marcus Holt. He's asserting hostile work environment, Diane said. He poured a food tray on me in front of 50 witnesses at 715. After I'd worked a 12-hour overnight shift, Claire said. I know. Is there a counter-complaint process? Diane was quiet for a moment. She set her coffee down and looked at Claire with the expression of someone who is about to say something they wish they didn't have to say. I was approached yesterday, quietly, by someone from Colonel Ashford's office. The suggestion was made that a voluntary lateral transfer might be an option worth discussing with you. Brixton Air Medical has an opening at your grade level. Your record would be unaffected. Your seniority would carry. I'm not filing a transfer request. Claire, my record is already clean. The reports I filed are accurate. The discrepancies I documented are real, and I stand behind every number in them. I believe you, Diane said. And she meant it. Claire could hear that she meant it. I am also telling you that something is moving at a level above my ability to affect it, and that declining this offer is going to cost you something in the short term. I understand that, Claire said. I'm still not leaving because someone wants me gone. Diane looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of someone trying to determine whether the person across from them is reckless or simply knows something they don't. Document everything, she finally said. Be careful about who you speak to inside this building, and watch your back. It was the most honest thing anyone at Harlow Ridge had said to her in 14 months. That evening, she stood in front of her kitchen dry erase board for a long time. The board was covered in reference numbers, date entries, initials, and a timeline running the full width of the surface. No full names visible to anyone who didn't already know the context. Just the architecture of what she'd found, laid out in the way she'd learned to organize evidence linear, cross-referenced, with the gaps marked as clearly as the confirmed points, because gaps were information too. She added 2 new entries. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 11 months. Let it ring twice. Ended the call. 22 minutes later, a message came back from a number not saved in her contacts. 4 words, received. Stay in position. She deleted the message, set her alarm for 430, and lay down. At 11:47 p.m., the alert she'd quietly set up on Harlow Ridge's secondary pharmaceutical storage unit fired on her phone. A monitoring notification built using technical knowledge she wasn't supposed to have and had never explained to anyone on the base. The alert showed a credential access entry for a sector clearance that the listed's supervisor almost certainly had not initiated. She stared at it. Then she opened the thread and typed, "Clock is moving." She put the phone face down. 14 months of showing up early and leaving late. 11 weeks of building something in silence that nobody around her could see. Conduct review. The transfer offer. The food tray at 715 in a cafeteria full of witnesses. Every single pressure point applied in sequence, designed to move her out of the building before she found the last piece. They had just made their first unscripted move. And unscripted moves, in Claire's experience, drawn from a part of her history that Harlow Ridge knew nothing about, meant that the pressure inside an operation had exceeded what its architects could manage cleanly. Scared people made mistakes. Mistakes left evidence. And somewhere inside Harlow Ridge Military Medical Center tonight, someone was working fast inside a storage sector they believed was still invisible, still safe, still theirs to control. They had run out of time and didn't know it yet. They had run out of time and didn't know it yet. That thought stayed with Claire through the 4 hours of sleep she managed before her alarm pulled her back up at 430. She lay there for exactly 90 seconds after it went off a habit, not laziness running through the sequence of what she knew, what she could prove, and what she still needed. The gap between the second and third category had been narrowing for weeks. Last night's access alert had narrowed it further, but narrower wasn't closed, and closed was the only version that mattered. She showered, dressed, and was in her car by 515. The road from her apartment to the base was empty. At that hour, the high plain still dark and the mountains to the west just beginning to separate from the sky behind them. She drove with the radio off. She was thinking about Tom Yarrow, specifically about the fact that his keycard had been used in the secondary pharmaceutical storage sector at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which was not a shift he was scheduled for, not a sector he had routine authorization to access independently, and not a time of night that any legitimate supply management function required. She had 3 prior instances of his signature on documentation that didn't match physical reality. She now had a 4th data point that connected him to the physical location where the supplies were disappearing. That was enough to build on. The question was, who else was in the structure above him? Because Tom Yarrow was not the architect. She had been certain of that for weeks. His access level was functional, not administrative. He could move supplies and alter receiving logs. But the system-level back-end alterations, the ones that required administrative credentials to the inventory management platform, the ones that had been constructing the false paper trail since at least late October, those required someone with authority above his pay grade. Someone who could issue directives that Yarrow would follow without asking too many questions, because in a military medical environment, people who issued directives from a certain level rarely got questioned about the reasoning behind them. She badged through the main gate at 538 and parked in the staff lot. Space at that hour had its own particular atmosphere, not quiet exactly, because military installations were never fully quiet, but operating at a lower register. Maintenance crews moving between buildings. The kitchen staff already inside the cafeteria, starting the first meal rotation. Pair of soldiers jogging the perimeter road in the gray pre-dawn. Claire walked to the medical center's side entrance, badged in, and went directly to the supply room. She had been inside for 6 minutes when she found it. The overnight log for primary pharmaceutical storage, a physical binder kept at the supply desk, updated by whatever staff member completed last rounds, had an entry at 2,340 for a controlled substance verification count. The entry was in the handwriting of a night staff, LPN, named Rosa Teller, who had been working the overnight rotation. Standard enough, except that the count totals in the entry didn't match the count totals from the previous evening's log, which was the log Claire herself had verified and signed at 1,847 the day before. 72 units of a high-grade injectable pain management medication, logged as present in last night's verification, not matching the count from 24 hours prior. There were two explanations. Either Rosa Teller had made a counting error possible, it happened, or the count had been artificially reconciled in the log to cover a withdrawal that had already occurred before Teller's round began. If Yarrow had moved into secondary pharmaceutical storage at 11:47, and the primary count was showing reconciled numbers that didn't track from the prior evening, then the sequence of events was becoming readable in a way that was no longer circumstantial. Claire photographed both log pages with her personal phone. She returned the binder to its exact position. She did not touch anything else. She was at her regular workstation with a routine supply order form on her screen by 601. When the first day shift staff began arriving, Rosa Teller was 26 years old, 3 years out of her LPN program, and had the particular energy of someone who worked hard and still hadn't entirely figured out the specificity whether this specific environment was where she was supposed to be. She arrived at 615, poured herself coffee from the break room pot, and was hanging up her jacket when Claire came in behind her. "How was the overnight?" Claire asked. "Quiet until about 2, Rosa said. "Then we had a respiratory intake from Barracks B that kept me moving until 5. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You're in early. Supply order deadline," Claire said. She poured her own coffee, kept her voice at the same register. She used for every ordinary morning conversation, unhurried, not pushing. "Did you do the controlled substance count on your own last night, or did someone come through with you?" Rosa looked at her, not suspiciously, just thinking back. "I did the primary storage count on my own, around 2,340. That's normal for overnight when we're short-staffed. Why? I'm seeing a variance between last night's totals and my previous count. Probably a transcription issue on my end. I just want to trace it before I submit the weekly reconciliation." Rosa relaxed. Supply reconciliation questions were not unusual coming from Claire. "I can pull my count sheet if that helps. I keep a rough draft before I transfer to the log. That would actually be really helpful. No rush whenever you get a minute today." It was not a transcription issue on Claire's end, and they both would never know that Rosa's count sheet was going to become evidence in a federal criminal investigation. Claire refilled her coffee and went back to her workstation and kept working. By 900, the medical center had shifted into its full operational rhythm patient intake, morning rounds, the administrative wing filling up, the pharmacy window opening, supply requests coming in from the ward stations. Claire moved through her morning the way she always did, which was to say efficiently, and without drawing attention to herself, which had always been easier in busy environments than quiet ones. Because in a busy environment, nobody was watching any one person closely enough to notice what they were actually doing. At 923, she had her first confirmation that the pressure on her was increasing. She was in the supply corridor, heading toward the trauma prep area, when she nearly walked directly into Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Ashford, the base's deputy commander, coming from the administrative wing with a junior officer at his heel. Ashford was 53, trim, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had learned over decades to give away nothing it didn't intend to give away. He was the highest-ranking medical administrator at Harlow Ridge. He was also, according to the organizational chart Claire had mapped on her dry erase board, the person whose authorization level matched the back-end system access required for the falsified documentation trail. She had not yet confirmed that directly. Ashford stopped when he saw her. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second, where something moved across his face that was not quite surprise, because a man at his level didn't get surprised easily, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration. He recovered smoothly and gave her the kind of brief, cordial nod that senior officers gave to staff. They were acknowledging without engaging. "Nurse Novak," he said. "Colonel Ashford," she said. He moved past her. She continued toward the trauma prep area. What she had noticed and filed was the recalibration. The fraction of a second, where a man who projected total composure had needed to find it rather than simply having it. That told her something about the state of the operation and the state of the person running it, and what it told her was that the access alert from last night had not been a routine move. It had been a reactive one. They were trying to clean something up. At 1140, Marcus Holt found her in the main supply room. He came alone. No NCOs, no performance. He stepped inside and pulled the door, almost closed, behind him, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who had been awake much of the night and had made some decisions that were costing him something. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I'm working," Claire said. She was reconciling a supply intake form against a delivery receipt, and she did not look up immediately. "I know. This won't take long." He paused. "I owe you an apology. For the cafeteria. For all of it, actually." She looked up then. She examined him the way she examined things she needed accurate readings on, without expression, without doubt the social performance of reassurance. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay? What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Something more than okay. If you want absolution, I'm not the right person." She set the form down. "If you want to have an actual conversation, I have about 10 minutes before I need to submit this count." He came further into the room. He looked at the shelving, at the floor, at somewhere between the two, and then he looked at her. "Someone told me you were a problem." Not in those exact words, but that was the message. That your reports were creating unnecessary friction, that you were flagging discrepancy that didn't actually matter, that the easiest solution for everybody was if you requested a transfer before the conduct review process ran its course. He stopped. I believed it. "I want to be honest with you about that. I'm not going to pretend I was set up from the start and I had no part in it. Pushed you. I made your job harder. I did that because someone handed me a narrative, and I didn't look at it carefully enough." Claire watched him. "Who handed you the narrative?" "Quiet. Marcus." She used his first name with deliberate weight. "If someone in the command structure here is using your conduct as a tool to remove a problem from their operational environment, you are now connected to this, whether you chose to be or not. That conduct review has your name on it. You need to understand what that means if this goes where I think it's going." He looked at her steadily. "Where do you think it's going?" "That depends on what you decide to do in the next 12 hours. She picked the form back up. "I need you to think carefully about who gave you the information about me. Specific person. The specific conversation. And then I need you to think about whether you want to file a formal complaint with me through the Army Criminal Investigation Division, or whether you want to walk out of this room and lets this play out without you. What happens if I walk?" "Then you walk." She said it without inflection. "I'm not running a recruitment drive, but if you file with me, we move fast enough that they don't have time to reorganize the documentation trail before investigators are looking at it." "You've already been talking to CID," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer that directly. 600 tomorrow. Give me an answer by then." She looked back at her form. "Close the door on your way out." He stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he left, and she heard the door click shut behind him and she sat very still for a moment and thought about the fact that she had just had a conversation she had not planned to have yet, which meant the timeline was compressing, whether she was ready or not. She submitted the supply count and went back to work. What happened between 1,000, 400 and 1,000, 730 that afternoon was the kind of thing that looked from the outside completely ordinary. Claire completed a trauma supply audit in Bay 3. She processed 2 incoming equipment deliveries. She attended a 15-minute staff's scheduling meeting in which she said nothing because nothing relevant to her required saying. She submitted 3 routine forms through the standard administrative portal. She ate half a sandwich at her desk at 1,530 because she had missed lunch, and her body had started registering the deficit in a way that was becoming distracting. What was not visible during those same hours was the rest of it. At 1,412, Rosa Teller brought her the handwritten count sheet from the previous night's controlled substance round. Claire thanked her, made a show of comparing it to the log entry, and nodding, as though confirming a minor discrepancy had been resolved, and photographed it in the supply room when she was alone. Rosa's rough count sheet showed a number that matched Claire's previous evening total, not the number that had appeared in the official log, meaning that between the time Rosa completed her count and the time the entry was made into the physical binder, someone had accessed the binder and altered the total. Someone who knew that the night staff did their controlled substance count solo, who knew the time window in binder which the binder was unattended between count completion and log entry, and who had physical access to the supply desk. That was a narrow set of people. At 1,537, Claire used a routine equipment transfer request as justification for accessing the secondary storage unit's physical entry log, a paper backup kept in a binder at the unit's entrance, maintained as a redundancy requirement by base protocol. She had 40 seconds in the anteroom before the next person came through. She photographed 11 pages of the log. She replaced it and left. At 1,618, she was back at her workstation, reviewing the photographs when she noticed something that made her set her coffee cup down carefully and sit very still. Tom Yarrow's keycard entry from 11:47 the previous night was in the digital access log she'd been monitoring. But in the paper backup log, the redundant physical record, there was no entry for that time at all. The page was continuous. No gap, no correction, no erasure. Just a clean record, with nothing in the 2,300-100 window. The paper log and the digital log were supposed to be parallel records. 2 independent systems recording the same events. They were not recording the same events, which meant someone with access to the digital system was logging entries that were never reflected in the physical backup, creating a secondary paper trail that existed only in the electronic system, which could be altered, and not in the physical one, which could not be changed after the fact without evidence of tampering. The falsified documentation wasn't just covering the removal of supplies. It was creating a fictional entry record, phantom movements, phantom access, phantom authorizations that could be used to redirect an investigation toward people who hadn't done anything if one ever started. Claire's name was in the digital system's keycard log for a sector she had never entered. She understood now that this had not been a system glitch. It had been the beginning of a contingency plan. She left the base at 1,802, which was 15 minutes earlier than her usual departure, and which she managed by completing her end-of-shift documentation, 7 minutes faster than normal, which required a level of focus she felt in the back of her neck as a dull tension that didn't fully release until she was through the main gate. She drove 2 miles east on the highway, pulled into the gravel lot of a gas station that had been out of business for at least 2 years based on the state of the pumps, and sat with the engine running, called the number again. This time it answered on the first ring. "We have a problem with the scope," she said. The voice on the other end said, "Tell me." The digital access system is being used to generate entries that don't correspond to the physical backup logs. I have photographic documentation of a specific discrepancies, same time, window, same sector, two records that should be identical and aren't. Someone with administrative level system access is fabricating a secondary entry record. A pause. For redirection. Yes. And my keycard ID has been used in the digital system for at least one entry I didn't make. I originally accepted the system glitch explanation. I don't accept it now. How many people have that level of system access? This facility, based on what I can verify from the outside of the administrative network. 3. Possibly 4. You've narrowed it? I have a strong candidate at the top and a confirmed operative below him. I need one more connection between the two of them in the evidentiary record before I'm comfortable with what we hand over. The voice was quiet for a moment. You may not have time to get comfortable. I know. How are you on exposure? She thought about the conduct review. Transfer offer. Ashford's face in the corridor for a fraction of a second too long. Increasing, she said. They're moving faster than they planned to. Because something spooked them. Possibly the discrepancy reports. Possibly something else I haven't identified. Can you hold 24 more hours? I can hold 72 if I have to, she said. But I don't think they're giving me 72. Call ended. She sat in the dead gas station lot for another 4 minutes, watching a hawk hang motionless over the plain in the last of the afternoon light, and then she pulled back onto the highway and drove home. At 552 the following morning, Marcus Holt was waiting outside the staff entrance to the medical center. He was in civilian clothes, which she registered as significant. He had not come in uniform, which meant he had come as a person rather than as a rank, which was either a good sign or a very careful calculation on his part. He had a paper coffee cup in each hand. He held one out to her as she approached. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. "I'm in," he said. "Tell me who gave you the narrative." He glanced around the empty access road. The morning was cold, the sky just going pale at the edges. I was approached in the second week of my rotation by a man named Tom Yarrow, logistics coordinator. He told me you'd been creating significant internal friction with your supply reports, that you had a pattern of filing complaints as a way of generating leverage, and that the command team was looking for a way to move you out before the situation escalated. He paused. He presented it as me doing the facility a service, protecting unit cohesion. Did he approach you directly, or were you introduced to him by someone else? Holt looked at the ground. Colonel Ashford mentioned him, in passing. Said, if I had questions about base operations, Yarrow was a good resource. Claire kept her face even. Ashford pointed you to Yarrow. Yeah, and Yarrow gave you the story about me. Yeah, she drank some of the coffee. It was bad, which was what she'd expected from a base vending machine at 552, and she drank it anyway because she hadn't slept enough, and the caffeine was more important than the quality. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer. Not what sounds right, what's actually true. Okay. Did Ashford ever say anything to you directly about the supply discrepancy reports? Not Yarrow, Ashford himself. Holt was quiet for long enough that she knew he was actually thinking, not performing the act of thinking. Once. He said, and I remember this because it struck me as an odd for a deputy commander to say about a supply nurse, he said, that some people at the NCO level confuse diligence with intelligence and end up causing problems they don't have the experience to understand. He looked at her. I thought he was talking generally. I don't think he was. Claire nodded slowly, one small, precise nod. What happens now? Holt asked. Now you write down everything you just told me. Exact words where you remember them. Approximate where you don't. Dated and signed. You do it today before anything else happens. Because once this starts moving, you won't get a second chance to establish what you knew and when. And then we go to CID with a joint complaint that includes your testimony about the chain of communication, my documentation of the supply discrepancies, and the access log evidence. She paused. There will be an investigation. It will be uncomfortable. You will be asked things you don't want to answer. I know. and your role in the pressure campaign against me will be part of the record. He held her gaze. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had poured a food tray on her in front of 50 people and had spent 8 weeks treating her like a problem to be managed, rather than a person doing a job, and she did not feel anything particularly warm about him. But she registered that he was doing the harder thing when the easier option was still available to him, and that counted for something in her assessment, even if it didn't count for everything. 900, she said. We file this morning. She badged through the door and went inside. What neither of them knew at 552 that morning was that inside the Harlow Ridge Administrative Wing, in an office on the second floor that faced north toward the mountains, a phone call was already being made. Tom Yarrow had not gone home after his unauthorized sector access 2 nights prior. He had, instead, spent the better part of the following day understanding that the monitoring workaround he'd been told did not exist, apparently did exist, and that someone with the technical knowledge to build it had been watching the secondary pharmaceutical storage unit access list logs in real time. He had spent the night after that constructing a version of events that redistributed responsibility in a way that he believed was defensible. He had called Ashford at 530 that morning. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, Ashford sat at his desk in his office with the phone in his hand and the view of the Mulpouts out his window, going slowly lighter as the sun climbed the eastern edge, and he thought about the conduct review that was on file with Claire Novak's name on it, and the keycard entry logged under her ID for a sector she hadn't accessed, and the paper trail that had been constructed over the previous 4 months, with an operational care that had seemed sufficient until approximately 48 hours ago. He thought about what insufficient now meant. Then he picked up his phone and made a second call. To the base's administrative records office, he requested a full pull of all personnel files, access logs, and supply documentation for the previous 90 days. The administrator who took the call confirmed it and began processing the request at 548. 12 minutes later, Claire badged through the staff entrance. She did not know that Ashford had already started moving. She did not know that by requesting a full documentation pull, he had triggered an automatic notification in the base's records management system, a protocol put in place 2 years earlier after a records access incident at another installation that flagged any bulk personnel record requests made by command staff outside of standard review cycles. That notification went to an automated monitoring queue. 611 generated an alert. That alert was routed, according to the contact protocol embedded in the monitoring system, to a field office that had nothing to do with Harlow Ridge's regular chain of command. People in that field office had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal for longer than Claire had been at Harlow Ridge. And they were already moving before she reached her workstation. Claire didn't know that yet. What she knew at 614 on a Wednesday morning in early March was that she had 24 hours of evidence to organize, a joint complaint to file, and a supply intake form due by 800 that she needed to complete without any visible deviation from her normal routine. She sat down at her workstation, opened the intake form, and started working through it with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, because the single most important thing she could do right now was look exactly like herself. Holt had gone to find a private space to write his statement. She'd told him to use his personal device, not anything connected to the base network, and to keep it short and factual: dates, names, direct quotes where possible, approximate language where not. No interpretation, no context he couldn't verify. Just what was said by whom and when. He'd nodded like a man who understood the assignment, which was an improvement over the man who'd handed her a food tray 8 weeks ago. She submitted the intake form at 748 and spent the next 40 minutes doing exactly what her shift required: supply requests from Ward 2, a controlled substance cosign for the pharmacy, a physical check of the trauma bay consumables that she completed methodically and without hurrying. She was in the middle of documenting a low inventory flag on surgical-grade irrigation solution when Diane Marsh appeared in the supply room doorway. Diane looked like she hadn't slept well. Her hair was done, and her lanyard was straight, and her expression was professionally composed. But there was something behind the eyes that Claire read as a specific kind of tension, the tension of someone who has received information they weren't prepared for and hasn't yet decided what to do with it. "Can I close this?" Diane said, gesturing to the supply room door. "Go ahead." Diane closed it and stayed near it, not coming further into the room. "I got a call this morning from Dr. Voss's office. They're conducting a full administrative review of supply chain documentation for the past 90 days. All nursing staff with supply authorization are being asked to make themselves available for interviews. Starting this afternoon." Claire kept writing. "What time?" "They're scheduling between 1,300 and 1,700. You're listed for 1,530. "All right." Diane looked at her. "Claire, a full 90-day pull initiated by the administrative wing on less than 12 hours' notice, that's not a routine audit." "No," Claire agreed. "It's not. Do you know what's happening?" Claire set her pen down and looked at Diane directly. "I know that the situation I told you about is moving faster than either of us planned. I know that the people I've been documenting are aware that their timeline is under pressure. And I know that a request for a full documentation pull initiated by command staff outside of a standard review cycle triggers a specific notification protocol in the records management system." She paused. "Did you know that?" Diane blinked. "I know I didn't. Most people don't." Claire picked her pen back up. "Don't cancel any of your morning appointments. Act like today is a normal day, because for you it should be. And for you, I'll be at my 1,530 interview," Claire said, "and I'll be fine." Diane stood there for another moment, reading her face, and then she nodded once the nod of someone who has decided to extend a trust they can't fully justify and left. Claire finished the irrigation flag documentation. Then she took out her personal phone and sent a single-word message to the number she'd called from the gas station parking lot. "Accelerating." The response came back in 4 minutes. "We're already here." She read it twice, put the phone away, went back to work. People who were already there had driven through the night from a field office in Denver. There were 4 of them, and they arrived at Harlow Ridge in 2 unmarked government vehicles at 841, badging through the main gate with credentials that the gate sergeant processed without comment and then immediately reported up his chain of command, because those credentials Army Criminal Investigation Division, Special Investigations Branch, were not something a gate sergeant at a mid-sized military medical center saw on a routine Tuesday and treated as routine. The sergeant's report reached the administrative wing at 849. It reached Colonel Ashford's desk at 853. Ashford had been expecting this. Not this fast, he'd estimated. He had at least 48 hours, possibly 72, before an external response could be organized and deployed. The fact that 4 CID investigators were on his base before 900 on the same morning he'd initiated the documentation pull told him something had been in motion before his request had triggered anything. Someone had already been watching. He sat with that understanding for approximately 96 seconds. Then he called his personal attorney. The CID team went first to the base commander's office, as protocol required. They met with Colonel Sandra Birch, the base commander, who had not been read into the investigation, and whose reaction to being handed a federal warrant for records access was, by all accounts, controlled but not warm for 22 minutes. When they came out, they had authorization to access the administrative records office, the supply chain management system, and the pharmaceutical storage logs going back 120 days. They had not yet spoken to Claire. That was by design. At 1947, 2 things happened simultaneously that changed the shape of the day. First was that Tom Yarrow called in sick. The second was that the automated alert system that monitors controlled substance inventory at Harlow Ridge, a system separate from the supply management platform, running on its own server, logging every dispensation and count verification against a rolling baseline, flagged an anomaly in the previous night's records. Flag was generated not because of the count discrepancy Claire had already identified, but because the automated system's baseline calculation had detected a pattern across the previous 11 weeks that exceeded its statistical threshold for random variance. The system had been seeing what Claire had been seeing in aggregate and had finally accumulated enough data points to generate a formal alert. That alert went to the pharmacy director, a quietly competent man named Dr. Elliot Grayson, who had been running the Harlow Ridge pharmacy for 9 years and who had seen the individual monthly variance reports without finding any single one of them alarming enough to escalate. He looked at the automated alert, looked at the 11-week trend data attached to it, and picked up his phone. He called Diane Marsh first, because that was his professional instinct loop in nursing leadership before going to command. Diane told him, with careful phrasing, that he should consider calling the CID team that had arrived that morning before going to anyone in the administrative wing. He did. The CID team received that call at 1053. Their senior investigator, a woman named Special Agent Dara Okonkwo, listened to Grayson for 4 minutes without interrupting, asked him 2 questions, and then told him to secure all physical pharmaceutical records and not allow any access to the storage units until her team had completed an inventory. She said it psychology. She said it the way people say things when they are confirming something they already suspected, rather than learning something new. At 1108, the secondary pharmaceutical storage unit was placed under federal seal. 1112, Tom Yarrow, who was not, it turned out, at home sick, was reached by phone at a location 30 miles south of the base and asked to return immediately for an interview. The person who called him was not from HR. Claire learned about the storage unit seal at 1120 when a ward nurse came to the supply room to request a medication, and Claire went to pull from secondary backup stock and found the federal tape across the door and a uniformed MP standing in the anteroom who told her. Access was restricted, pending an active investigation. She stood in the anteroom for a moment, looking at the tape, and thought about the 11 weeks it had taken to get here, and the fact that it had arrived 6 hours earlier than she'd calculated, and in a sequence she hadn't fully predicted. Then she updated her plan by approximately 30 seconds of internal adjustment and went back to her workstation. 1219. Her personal phone showed a message. Interview moved to 1100. Come to the base commander's conference room. Ask for Okonkwo. She had missed the message by an hour. She typed back, available now. The response was immediate. Come now. She told the ward station she was stepping away for a meeting, which was true, sat and walked to the administrative building, which was a 4-minute walk across the central courtyard. The morning had clouded over, and the wind had picked up from the northwest, carrying a cold that cut through her scrubs in the 40 seconds she was outside. She hadn't brought a jacket. She noticed this, without it mattering, and kept walking. The base commander's conference room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with the official photographs of Harlow Ridge's commanding officers going back to the facility's founding. Claire walked past them without looking and knocked on the closed door. Come in, said a voice. Special Agent Dara Okonkwo was 44 years old, compact and precise in her movements, close-cropped natural hair, and the particular quality of stillness that investigators develop when they've spent enough years in rooms with people who are trying to read them. She was sitting on one side of the conference table, with on one side of the with a legal pad and a closed laptop and a paper cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting long enough to stop being worth drinking. Across from her was an empty chair. A second investigator, a younger man named Ferris, sat at the far end of the table with his own materials. Okonkwo looked at Claire when she came in. Not the way most people looked at her with the sliding focus of someone who had already filed her in the civilian nurse category and was moving on. She looked at her the way a careful person looks something they've been curious about for a while. "Nurse Novak," she said. "Sit down." Claire sat. "I'm going to skip the part where I explain who we are and why we're here," Okonkwo said, "because I think you already know." "I think I have a reasonable working knowledge," Claire said. Something shifted in Okonkwo's face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. The notification that flagged the records pull this morning, that wasn't what brought us here. We've been tracking a supply diversion pattern at this installation for approximately 6 weeks through a parallel investigation that originated from a procurement anomaly flagged at the regional logistics level. She paused. "We became aware of you when a contact registered a communication from this base using a protocol channel that we weren't expecting a civilian supply nurse to have access to." Claire said nothing. "I'd like to understand how a nurse at a mid-level military medical installation in Wyoming has access to a secure protocol communication channel managed by a branch of the Army that has nothing to do with this facility," Okonkwo said. Her voice was even and curious rather than accusatory, and that was more unsettling than accusation would have been. "Have been." "I think you already know the answer to that," Claire said. Okonkwo looked at her for a long moment. "Walk me through your documentation." From the beginning, Claire walked her through it. It took 41 minutes. She was precise and sequential dates, reference numbers, the specific discrepancies, and the pattern they formed, the access log divergence between the digital system and the physical backup, Rosa Teller's handwritten count sheet versus the altered log entry, Euro's signature synchron 3 receiving documents for supplies that had disappeared, and the administrative level system's access required for the back-end alterations she'd identified. She laid it out without editorializing, without emphasis, without the kind of narrative shaping that could be later characterized as interpretation. Just the sequence of facts in the order she had found them. When she finished, Ferris had filled 4 pages of his legal pad, and Okonkwo's coffee was even less worth drinking. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The keycard entry under your ID, logged in the digital system only, not reflected in the physical backup for the same time window. You believe it was placed to redirect. I believe it was placed to create an evidentiary problem for any investigation that started from a complaint I filed. If I'm the complainant and my keycard shows access to a restricted sector I can't account for, it complicates my credibility. But you identified the divergence between the digital and physical logs. Yes, before or after the conduct review was filed. I confirmed it after. I had the physical backup photographs by 1537, the day after the cafeteria incident." Okonkwo wrote something. "Nurse Novak, I need to ask you something directly and I need a direct answer. All right, your background. Before this posting," the room was very quiet. Through the window behind Okonkwo, Claire could see the courtyard and the wind moving through the dry grass at the edge of the walking path. She had known this moment was coming. She had been deciding, in a quiet back corner of her planning, exactly how to handle it when it arrived. "I held a classification that has since been administratively separated from my current employment record," she said. "The specifics are available to you through a channel request to a unit designation I can provide. What I can tell you here, in this room, is that before I was a supply nurse at Harlow Ridge, I was a combat medical specialist in a classified operational unit, and the skills and training from that period are relevant to my ability to identify what was happening in this facility and document it the way I have." Okonkwo had stopped writing. She was looking at Claire with an expression that had shifted from investigated to something more personal, not warm exactly, but something like recognition. The looks of someone seeing a shape they know from a different context, suddenly appearing in an unexpected place. "How long were you in?" she asked. It was not an investigator's question. It was a person's question. 8 years, Claire said. 2 deployments. Okonkwo nodded once, slowly. Then she picked up her pen. "I'm going to need that unit designation." The interview ended at 1347. Claire walked back across the courtyard in the cold wind and went to the break room and made herself a cup of coffee. That was better than the vending machine version, but not by much, and she sat at the small table in the corner and let herself be still for 4 minutes, not thinking, just sitting. The tension in the back of her neck that had been there since 430 that morning was not gone, but it had changed quality. It was still present, but it had become the tension of something in motion rather than something held in place. And that was a different kind of load to carry. She had told 2 people today who she was, in different registers of completeness. Okonkwo had understood immediately. Holt had understood partially and was still processing. Diane had understood enough to give professionally. Diane had understood enough to give her room. The thing that nobody in the break room knew, the thing that nobody at Harlow Ridge had known for 14 months, was that Claire Novak had not ended up at this installation thing by accident, and the reason she'd been so careful with her documentation was not just the professional habit of a thorough nurse. Finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went back to her shift. 1,502. Marcus Holt found her in the trauma bay, where she was restocking the crash cart, which needed restocking because it had been partially depleted in the early morning respiratory reintake and had not been fully addressed by the day shift because they'd been short-staffed, and the cart was not technically due for a formal restock until 1,600. Came in without announcement, which she registered without reacting to it. I gave my statement to CID 20 minutes ago, he said. Kept working. How did it go? They asked me a lot of questions I wasn't prepared for. He leaned against the wall. One of them, the woman Okonkwo, she asked me how I was initially assigned to Harlow Ridge, whether the rotation was requested or placed. Claire paused for a fraction of a second. What did you tell her? The truth, that the placement came through standard rotation scheduling, but that Ashford's office reached out to me specifically before I arrived, to brief me on what they called operational culture. He looked at the floor. I thought it was normal. It's not. I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. They showed me something. A phone record. A call from the base administrative line to my unit's XO 2 weeks before my rotation started. Claire set down the IV supplies she was holding. She turned and looked at him. Ford pre-selected you, she said. That's what they're suggesting. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant that the pressure campaign against her had not been an opportunistic response to her being in the wrong place. It had been planned. Someone had looked at the rotation schedule. In schedule, identified a candidate who could be given a specific narrative and pointed in a specific direction and arranged for that person to arrive at Harlow 6 weeks before the supply diversion was due complete its current phase. She had been under active countermeasures before she'd even started building her case. What else? She said. Holt looked uncomfortable. They asked me if I had knowledge of any situation in which base personnel had accessed records relating to your previous military service. He met her eyes. I didn't. But the fact that they asked it means someone did, Claire said. He nodded. She picked the IV supplies back up. She finished the crash cart, stocks in silence, and Holt stood against the wall and watched her work, and neither of them said anything else for 2 minutes. Then she closed the cart, stripped her gloves, and said, "Go back to your unit. Don't discuss any of this with anyone on base until Okonkwo tells you otherwise. If Ashford's office contacts you directly, you're unavailable. Claire." He said her name the way people say a name when they're about to say something they've been holding for a while. "I need to ask you something." She waited. "Were you sent here? To this base specifically?" She looked at him. She held the look for long enough that a person paying attention would understand it as an answer, and then she said, "Finish the day. Keep your head down." She pushed the crash cart back into position and left the trauma bay. What happened between 1,600 and 1,800 moved faster than anything in the previous 14 months. At 1,612, Tom Yarrow arrived back at the base under MP escort. He had not come voluntarily. He had been reached 30 miles south on a state highway, heading toward the Colorado border, which was information that did not make him look like a man who had called in sick for legitimate reasons. He was taken directly to an interview room in the administrative building. At 1634, Colonel Ashford's personal attorney arrived at the main gate. He was not admitted to the base. He was told his client was available to communicate with him by phone and that physical access required authorization that was currently above the gate sergeant's ability to grant. The attorney made 3 calls in the parking lot outside the gate and then drove away. 1641, the base commander, Colonel Sandra Birch, issued a facility-wide operational hold on all non-emergency administrative record access. This meant that nobody inside the administrative wing could transfer, delete, alter, or export any documentation until the hold was lifted by federal investigative authority. The hold notification went to every department head simultaneously. 1658. Patricia Voss, the administrative director, who had offered Claire a transfer in a carefully worded conversation about fitting into existing command structures, arrived at her office to find a CID investigator waiting in her chair and her computer, displaying a federal access authorization screen that she had not initiated. 1712, Claire received a message from Okonkwo, "Stay on base. Don't go anywhere without notifying us." She was in the staff parking lot, about to get into her car. She went back inside. The break room at 1730 was empty except for Claire and the particular silence of a building that had been running at high tension all day and was now in the specific stillness that precedes a resolution none of its occupants can yet see. She sat at the small corner table with a cup of water, drinking in the low-level physical awareness of someone who has been operating at sustained high output for 14 months and can feel the point at which the load is about to shift. She heard the door open and turned. It was Okonkwo. The investigator came in, poured herself a cup of coffee without checking whether it was fresh it wasn't, and sat down across from Claire with the expression of someone who has found something they were looking means and is still working out what it means. "Euro is talking," Okonkwo said. Claire said nothing. Started cooperating 40 minutes into the interview. He gave us 3 names. Ashford was the first. She drank the bad coffee without reacting to it. The second was Voss. Claire had suspected Voss from week 9. The supply of information available to the operation, the knowledge of audit cycles, administrative protocols, the specific structure of the documentation trail was consistent with someone at the administrative director level. She hadn't been able to place it evidentiary until now. Third name, Okonkwo said, is someone you haven't flagged. Claire looked at her. A physician. On your trauma rotation. Name of Dr. Raymond Stoke. Okonkwo set her coffee down. According to Yarrow, Stoke was responsible for the medical authorization side of the diversion, signing off on disposal orders for supplies that weren't actually expired, providing clinical cover for transfers that were logged as patient use and weren't. He's been on the rotation for 7 months. Claire ran the name and the face in the 7 months against her own timeline. She thought about the trauma kit logged as expired on a date, after she'd personally verified it as operational. A physician's signature on a disposal order was what made that move possible. She had been looking at the supply chain for the authorization. She had been looking in the right direction, but one position to the left. "Where is he now?" she said. Okonkwo looked at her with an expression that Claire couldn't immediately read. "That's the problem," she said. "He left the facility at 1540. His keycard logged him out of the parking structure at 1543. We have a bolo active, but he had a 90-minute head start before we identified him as a subject. The break room was very quiet. His apartment?" Claire said. "Cleared. Personal vehicle is gone. No activity on his base-issued devices since 1538. Claire looked at the table. She thought about 7 months, and a physician's access level, and the specific nature of someone who could maintain that kind of operation for that long. without cracking under the daily pressure of running a functional trauma rotation alongside it. He has somewhere to go, she said. We think so. And if he reaches it, then this gets significantly more complicated, Okonkwo said. The lights in the break room hummed quietly above them. Outside the window, the Wyoming plain had gone full dark, and the wind was pressing against the glass in a low, continuous sound. And somewhere to the south, on a state highway that connected Harlow Ridge to the interstate and the interstate to everywhere else, a man with 7 months of operational knowledge and a 90-minute lead was making decisions that the next 12 hours would determine. Claire's phone buzzed on the table between them. She turned it over. Screen showed a number she didn't recognize. A text message with no greeting and no context. Just a set of coordinates and 2 words beneath them. Come alone. Claire stared at the coordinates for 3 seconds, long enough to run the location against her mental map of the terrain around Harlow Ridge, the access roads, the highway intersections, the stretches of high plain that existed between this base and the Colorado border, in the specific configuration of someone who had spent 14 months driving the same routes and paying attention to things most people didn't bother cataloging. Coordinates placed the location 11 miles southeast. Off the highway, up a service road that dead-ended at a decommissioned communications relay station the base had stopped actively maintaining 2 years ago. She knew the road. She'd driven past the turnoff 40 times without ever going up it. She turned the phone toward Okonkwo. The investigator read the screen without touching the device. Her expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of response. She pulled out her own phone and stepped toward the window, speaking quietly. Claire caught fragments, coordinates, relay station, 11 out, and then Okonkwo was back at the table and looking at her with the specific focus of someone running a calculation they don't have all the variables for. You're not going alone, Okonkwo said. I know, and you're not going ahead of my team. I know that too. Claire looked at the message again. He sent it to my personal number. Not a baseline, not a department contact. My personal number, which means he either pulled it from administrative personnel records or he had it from another source. She set the phone face down. He wants me specifically. That tells you something about what he needs from this conversation. Tells me he's trying to control the terms of his own surrender. Or he has something he thinks I'll respond to that your team won't. She looked at Okonkwo. Either way, I think he's still at those coordinates. A man who wanted to run would have kept driving. Okonkwo made 2 more calls in the next 4 minutes. When she finished, she looked at Claire with an expression that had moved from investigative to something that was, if not quite collaborative, then at least adjacent to it. My team will approach from the north axis. You ride with Ferris. You don't get out of the vehicle until I clear the location. She paused. And I need your personal weapon if you're carrying one. Claire met her eyes. I'm not. A pause. All right. They left the break room at 1,748. The drive took 19 minutes on roads that were dark and mostly empty, the headlights cutting through a Wyoming night that had come in fully and brought the temperature down to the kind of cold that made the truck's heater work audibly. Ferris drove without conversation, which Claire appreciated. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the terrain and thought about Raymond Stoke, 7 months on the trauma rotation. Functional, apparently competent, carrying the operational weight of a criminal enterprise alongside a clinical schedule that required its own sustained performance. That kind of compartmentalization didn't come naturally to most people. It required a particular psychological structure, the ability to wall off one version of your behavior from another, and maintain both without the seams showing. She'd known people like that. She'd worked alongside them in contexts that made Harlow Ridge look straightforward. The service road turnoff came up on the right, unmarked except for a reflective post that was angled slightly from weather. Ferris slowed and turned without being directed to, which told her he'd already run the coordinates and knew where they were going. The road was gravel for the first quarter mile and then became packed dirt that had frozen in the overnight temperatures and was rough enough to feel in the spine at any speed above 15 miles per hour. They drove up it with the headlights on low beam. The relay station appeared at the crest of a small rise, a squat concrete building, maybe 40 feet by 20, with a rusted antenna array on the roof that had long since stopped serving any functional purpose. The windows were covered from the inside. There was one vehicle parked at the north side of the building, a dark-colored sedan that Claire didn't recognize from the base parking structure. Ferris stopped the truck 200 yards short and killed the headlights. His radio crackled. Okonkwo's voice, North team in position. Hold. They held. 4 minutes passed. Claire watched the building. One of the covered windows showed a thin line of light at the edge, someone inside with a lamp or a phone. The wind moved across the plain in long, low waves that rocked the truck slightly and carried nothing useful. The radio, move up, stay with the vehicle. Ferris pulled forward slowly, gravel quiet under the tires, and stopped 30 feet from the building's south entrance. Okonkwo and 2 agents came around the north corner on foot, and one of them knocked on the metal door with the flat of his hand 3 times. A long pause. The door opened. Raymond Stoke looked older than he had that morning at Harlow Ridge, which was the specific way stress compressed time in a person's when they'd been running on adrenaline and had finally stopped. He was 51, tall, with the angular features of someone who'd always looked distinguished and was discovering that distinction didn't travel well to situations like this one. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark jacket, hiking pants, boots, and he had a duffel bag on the floor behind him that hadn't been packed with care. He looked at Okonkwo's credentials and then past her, to the truck, to the passenger window, where Claire was a shape behind glass. He said something to Okonkwo. Claire couldn't hear it. Okonkwo said something back. Then she turned toward the truck and made a gesture. Come here. Ferris put his hand on Claire's arm. The agent said, I heard her. Claire opened the door. The inside of the relay station was cold and smelled like concrete dust and old electronics, lit by a battery-powered work lamp that Stoke had apparently brought with him, which suggested this location had not been chosen impulsively. There was a folding chair, a bag of food from a gas station 40 miles south, and a laptop that was open on the floor with a cellular connection running. The laptop screen showed a file transfer in progress, or what had been a progress bar, now paused, because the cellular signal in this part of Wyoming was unreliable and the transfer had stalled at 63%. Claire looked at the laptop. Then it's Stoke. You've been trying to send something, she said. Insurance, he said. It didn't go through. He looked at the screen. His jaw worked once. No. Okonkwo positioned herself to Stoke's left. The 2 other agents had taken positions near the door. The room had the specific geometry of a situation that had already been decided and was now in the process of being formalized. Dr. Stoke, Okonkwo said, you reached out to Nurse Novak specifically. I'd like to understand why before we proceed to the formal portion of this. Stoke looked at Claire for a long moment. It was not a hostile look. It was something more complicated, the look of someone who has spent 7 months constructing a version of another person as an obstacle and is now standing in a room with the actual person and finding the distance between those 2 versions uncomfortable. I wanted to explain something, he said, before everything becomes the official version, and there's no room for anything else. I'm listening, Claire said. I didn't start this. He said it without defensiveness, which was more credible than if he'd said it the other way. Ashford approached me 14 months ago, before you arrived. He already had the network in place. Yarrow was handling the physical side. Voss was managing the administrative cover. He needed a physician to authorize the disposal documentation, clinical sign-off on equipment, and medication disposals that looked legitimate on paper. He paused. He had leverage. Claire waited. My license. He looked at the floor. Complaint from a previous posting that had been managed. Not fairly, in my view, but managed in a way that left documentation that could be reactivated. Ashford had access to it. He made clear what activation would mean. So you cooperated, Okonkwo said. I cooperated, Stokes said. The word came out flat and undefended. And then I kept cooperating because the exit point kept moving. Every time I thought I was close to the edge of it, there was another request, another disposal order, another transfer documentation to sign. He looked at Claire again. When you started filing the variance reports, Ashford told us you were a problem that would resolve itself. Then the conduct review didn't move you. Then Holt told Yarrow that you'd offered him a choice, and Yarrow panicked and made the move in secondary storage without authorization from Ashford. That's when everything started coming apart. What's on the laptop? Claire said. He looked at it. 7 months of email correspondence between Ashford and Voss, Ashford and Yarrow, and 3 external parties who were receiving the diverted supplies. He paused. I kept copies. Ashford didn't know. The room was quiet enough that Claire could hear the wind against the concrete exterior. Why are you telling me? She said. Why not just hand this to the investigators directly? He looked at her, and this time the expression was something she recognized, not guilt exactly, which was too clean, but the particular discomfort of a person who has done something they can't they've done, and is trying to find a shape for it that they can carry. Because you found it, he said. 14 months working alone, and you found all of it while they were using every institutional tool they had to move you out. I wanted you to hear it from me, that I knew what you were doing. I knew what it cost. He stopped. That probably doesn't mean anything. It means something, Claire said. It's not enough, but it means something. She looked at Okonkwo. Okonkwo gave her a small nod. Take the laptop, Claire said to Okonkwo. Then she walked back to the truck and got in and sat in the cold and listened to the wind work against the windows until Ferris came out 20 minutes later and drove her back to the base. The next 16 hours were the kind of hours that looked procedural from the outside and felt like sustained pressure from the inside. Stoke was formally arrested at the relay station and transported to a federal holding facility at 2023. His laptop was taken into evidence. The stalled file transfer the insurance he'd tried to send and failed was recovered from the device's sent queue and became part of the record. The external parties he'd named in his statement were 3 medical supply distribution companies operating under shell registrations, 2 in Nevada and 1 in Colorado that had been receiving military-grade pharmaceutical and trauma supply stock and moving it through secondary distribution networks at significant markup. The value of the diverted supplies over the operation's full run, which Seed's forensic accounting team would later determine had begun 22 months before Claire's arrival at Harlow Ridge, was just under $1.4 million. Ashford was formally arrested at 47 the following morning in his on-base residence. He said nothing during the arrest and nothing during the initial processing. His attorney, the one who'd been turned away from the main gate the previous afternoon, arrived at the federal field office in Denver at 300 and began making calls. Those calls did not produce the results he was hoping for, because the evidentiary record assembled by CID in the previous 12 hours was, by any professional measure, comprehensive. Patricia Voss was arrested at her off-base apartment at 112. She asked twice whether there was any possibility of a conversation before formal charges were filed. She was told that conversations could happen with her attorney present and that her attorney had been notified. She did not have the expression of someone who expected this outcome, which was interesting given how precisely she'd worded the warning she'd delivered to Claire about fitting into existing command structures. Claire was at the base at 800 the following morning because she had a shift and because her shift was part of her job and her job was still her job. The medical center was operating under a heightened administrative hold that had generated a specific kind of tension in the staff, the tension of people who knew something significant had happened and were still waiting to understand the full shape of it. There were federal vehicles in the parking structure. There were unfamiliar faces in the administrative wing. The pharmacy was operating under a temporary dual authorization protocol that Grayson had implemented at Okonkwo's request, and that had added about 11 minutes to every medication's dispensation cycle, and was making the ward nurses irritable. Claire processed her morning supply requests, completed a trauma bay restock, and co-signed 2 controlled substance counts with a pharmacy technician who was clearly exhausted and clearly trying to pretend she wasn't. She noticed that the conduct review filed by Holt had disappeared from her personnel file, not officially resolved, just no longer present, which was an administrative gap that she filed for follow-up and did not dwell on. There were more important things in motion. At 1040, Okonkwo appeared in the supply room doorway. "Sit down for a minute," she said. Claire sat. Okonkwo came in and stood against the shelving with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who is about to deliver a large amount of information in a compressed time frame. "Forensic accounting finished their preliminary run this morning," Okonkwo said. "The operation has been running for 22 months. The diverted supplies include controlled pharmaceuticals, trauma-grade surgical equipment, and high-value sterile consumables. Total estimated value is north of 1.3 million. Ford was the architect. Voss handled the administrative cover. Yarrow managed the physical logistics. Stoke provided clinical authorization. And there are 3 external distribution entities that are now under separate federal investigation. The soldiers who needed those supplies," Claire said. "We're doing a care impact assessment. It's going to take time. But yes, that's part of the formal record now." Claire nodded. "Keycard entry under my ID. Digital system manipulation. Confirmed." Ashford had administrative access to the access management platform and used it to create phantom entries. Yours was one of 2 other staff members. Also have fabricated entries in the digital log that don't appear in the physical backup. He was building a distributed redirect in case of investigation. What happens to those records? Corrected and sealed as part of the federal case file. Your record is clean. That's official as of this morning. Okonkwo uncrossed her arms. I also want to tell you that the unit designation you gave me, I made the call. I got a call back from someone fairly senior. They want to talk to you. About what? They were vague, which from that particular office usually means they're not vague. She paused. You're not in any trouble. It's the other direction. Claire looked at the shelving in front of the rows of labeled supplies, the color-coded system she'd built in her first week, the physical log that had been the quiet foundation of everything that had happened since. I'm going to finish my shift first, she said. Okonkwo almost smiled. I'll let them know. Marcus Holt found her in the corridor, outside the trauma bay, at 1330. He was in uniform, which was the version of him she'd seen least of in the past several days, and he looked like someone who had been through a specific kind of institutional ringer and had come out the other, side uncertain of his footing in a way that was new for him. I heard they arrested Ashford, he said. Yes. And Voss. And Stoke. He paused. And Yarrow is cooperating. That's correct. He stood there with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man assembling an apology that he knew was insufficient for what it needed to cover. I was told, when I arrived at Harlow Ridge, that this posting would be good for my record. Command climate here those were the exact words. Command climate. Ashford's office contacted your XO 2 weeks before your rotation started, Claire said. Okonkwo told you that yesterday. Yeah. He looked at the wall. I've been going back through everything. Every conversation I had with Yarrow. Every time I pushed back on your reports or made things harder in the unit. He stopped. I was a tool. I don't say that to excuse anything. I say it because I need to be able to say it out loud and hear what it sounds like. It sounds accurate, Claire said, and it sounds like something you already knew. He stopped again. Started differently. Did you know when I first started making things difficult for you? Did you know I was being used? She thought about that honestly, rather than giving him the answer that would be easier to hear. I suspected early that the pressure on me wasn't spontaneous. Timing was too precise. But I didn't have confirmation that Ashford pre-selected you until Okonkwo told me last night. So you were working around me, without knowing for certain that I wasn't just genuinely that guy. Yes, process that. How did you stay steady, knowing the pressure was coordinated and not knowing all the sources? She looked at him. I knew what I was doing and why. That was enough. It was a simple answer, and she meant it exactly as simply as it sounded, and she could see him working out that there was no hidden layer to it, and that the lack of a hidden layer was itself the point. The cafeteria, he said. Marcus, I need to say it properly, in front of other people, when the time comes, but also here. What I did in that cafeteria was wrong. It was deliberate, and it was humiliating, and it was done in front of an audience, because I wanted it to land that way. I can tell myself I was being managed, and I was running on bad information. And both of those things are true, and they don't change what I did. Claire looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I'm not carrying it, but I appreciate that you're not making it smaller than it was. He nodded once slowly. What happens now? To me. Your testimony is part of the record. Your conduct review against me has been removed. Beyond that, I think you talk to a JAG officer and find out what your obligations are going forward. She paused. You made the harder choice when the easier one was still available. That counts. It was the most she had to offer him, and she thought it was probably enough, and by the expression on his face, she could see that he thought so too. At 1,600, something happened that Claire had not anticipated, and that broke through the controlled professional surface she'd been maintaining since 800 in a way that very little else had managed. Diane Marsh came to the supply room and asked her to come to the nursing station. When Claire got there, she found the nursing station full, not a scheduled meeting, just people who had gradually migrated there throughout the afternoon. As word moved through the medical center in the way that word moves through closed institutional environments, faster and more completely than official communication ever manages. Nurses, corpsmen, pharmacy technicians, two physicians who had nothing to do with the operation and had simply been working alongside it for months while it quietly degraded the resources available to their patients. Diane said, "We wanted you to hear this from us directly, before it becomes official language in a memo." Then she said what the staff had agreed to say, which was not elaborate or formally worded, because Diane was practical and had advised against anything that sounded like a prepared speech. She said that what Claire had done alone, without institutional support, under active pressure to leave, had protected every patient who had come through Harlow Ridge's trauma bay in the past year. That it had protected the staff who'd been making clinical decisions with resources they hadn't known were being deliberately depleted. That it had been quiet and thorough and dangerous in ways that most of them were only beginning to understand. Claire stood at the edge of the nursing station and listened. She didn't cry because she was not someone who cried easily, and especially not front of people, and the gathering in the nursing station was not the kind of moment that required it anyway. But something in her chest shifted the particular physical sensation of 14 months of sustained solitary weight beginning to be redistributed, carried now by more than one set of hands. She said, "Thank you." She meant it without performance. Then she went back to work. At 1,820 that evening, as Claire was finishing her end-of-shift documentation, Okonkwo came to the supply room for the second time that day. This time she had a tablet in her hand, screen facing Claire, showing a document with a federal header that Claire recognized the format of from a previous professional life. "The call from your former unit," Okonkwo said. "They asked me to relay something before the formal conversation." Claire looked at the tablet. The document was a preliminary field assessment, an internal review format she knew well, brief and structured, organized around categories she also knew well. At the top, in the field reserved for subject identification, was her full name and her real rank, which was not the civilian equivalent of her nursing grade, but something else, entirely a designation from a classification that had been administratively separated from her current record but had apparently not been as completely separated as she had been led to understand. Below her name, In the assessment summary field was a single line: conduct consistent with active operational standards. Full reinstatement eligible. She read it twice. Okonkwo watched her reading it. That means something to you? Yes, Claire said. She set the tablet down. She looked at the supply room around her, the shelving, the labels, physical log in the bottom drawer that had started this entire sequence with a notation in her fourth week about a box of wound care supplies that wasn't where it was supposed to be. She thought about what reinstatement eligible meant and what it didn't mean and what she hadn't decided yet. I need to finish this documentation, she said. Okonkwo took the tablet back. Take your time. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, they were looking for someone with your profile for this type of placement. Before you were assigned here, there were 2 other installations where the pattern hadn't surfaced because nobody inside had the combination of clinical access and investigative training to identify it. She looked at Claire. You were the right person for this. That's not a coincidence, Claire said. No, Okonkwo said, it's not. She left. Claire sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, the specific shape of being told that 14 months of isolation and institutional pressure and a food tray at 715 had been, at some level, above her visibility, known. That the quiet posting at a mid-sized military medical center in Wyoming had not been an accident of rotation, scheduling any more than Marcus Holt's arrival had been. The difference was that she had been sent here to find something real, and she had found it. She picked up her pen and finished the documentation. She did it carefully, completely, without rushing, because the documentation was part of the job, and the job was still the job. And she had always believed that the work itself was the thing, not the recognition of it, not the formal language of assessment summaries, not even the moment in the nursing station when Diane Marsh had said out loud what it had cost. The work, done completely. That was enough. She was signing the final form when her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Not the same unknown number as the night before, different prefix, different pattern. She opened it. The message was 4 lines. We pulled the full archive from the laptop. Transfer completed at 39% before the stall, not 63%. The remaining 24% contained a secondary recipient list that wasn't in Stokes' verbal statement. 17 names. 11 of them are inside military medical installations. This isn't one operation. It's a network. We need you in Denver by 800 tomorrow. Claire read it once. Read it again. Set the phone face down on the desk. She looked at the supply room, the room she had organized in her first week, the room she had returned to every morning for 14 months, the room where everything had started with a missing box of wound care supplies and a notation in a plain black notebook. Then she picked the phone back up and typed 2 words, I'll drive. She drove through the night. Not because she had to. Okonkwo had offered a transport, a driver, a federal vehicle with a warm back seat and nothing required of her except to sit in it, but because she needed the hours between Wyoming and Denver to belong entirely to herself. No one asking questions, no institutional air, just the highway unreeling in the headlights and the mountains to the west as a dark mass against a slightly less dark sky, and the particular silence of a person who has been operating at full capacity for a very long time and is, finally, incrementally, beginning to feel the edge of it. She stopped once, at a truck stop outside Cheyenne, for coffee and gas, and 10 minutes in a plastic booth, where she ate a sandwich she didn't taste, and stared at the parking lot, and let her mind go quiet. Trucker at the counter was arguing with the cashier about a charge on his receipt. A teenager in a Harlow Ridge high school, sweatshirt the town, not the base, was mopping the floor near the bathrooms, and clearly doing the minimum required. Normal life. The particular texture of ordinary existence going on around her like it always did, regardless of what had happened, or was happening, or was about to happen. She drove the rest of the way with the window, cracked, cold air keeping her alert, and reached the federal field office in Denver at 714. The office was on the 4th floor of a building that looked like every federal building, looked neutral, functional, slightly too warm inside, compared to the temperature outside. Okonkwo was already there. So was Ferris, and two people Claire didn't recognize who were introduced as analysts from the Regional Investigative Coordination Office, and one person she did recognize, a man she hadn't seen in 4 years, who went by the name Kettridge, and whose actual role had several layers of classification above what his business card said. Kettridge was 60, lean, gray in his hair, and the kind of face that had gotten better at hiding things as it had gotten older. He stood when she came in and offered his hand, and she shook it, and the specific quality of that handshake firm, even no performance in it, told her that the version of the conversation she'd been preparing for on the drive down was approximately correct. "You look tired," he said. "I drove from Wyoming," she said. "Down. There's real coffee." There was. She took it. Briefing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Claire sat through most of it quietly and asked precise questions at specific moments, and the picture that assembled itself across the conference table in that fourth-floor room was larger and more organized than even the message on her phone the previous evening had suggested. The Network Stokes laptop had exposed the 17 names in the secondary recipient list, connected supply diversion operations across 11 military medical installations in 5 states. The operations were not identical in structure. Each had been adapted to the specific administrative environment of its host facility, which meant they had been designed by someone with detailed knowledge of how different military medical centers operated, where their audit vulnerabilities were, and which personnel configurations allowed for the most sustainable concealment. Total value across all active operations, based on the preliminary forensic accounting, was north of $11 million over a 30-month period. Ashford had not been the architect. He had been a node. "We've had the top of this network in our peripheral vision for 14 months, Kettridge said. He was looking at Claire in a way that was specific rather than general. "The reason we placed you at Harlow Ridge was that the pattern there was clean enough to build a documented chain from the operational level to the distribution end. Other installations had fragments. Harlow Ridge had the right configuration for a complete evidentiary record if the right person was inside and patient enough to build it correctly. 14 months is a long time to be patient," Okonkwo said. She said it without editorial emphasis, but it landed with some anyway. "Yes," Kettridge said. "It is." Claire drank her coffee. "Hertzen at the top. We have a name. We've had a name for 8 months. What we've been missing is the chain of documented evidence that connects the name to the operational conduct." He paused. "The archive from Stokes' laptop completes 2 of the 3 links we need. The third link is in the documentation you built at Harlow Ridge, the cross-reference between the physical backup logs and the digital system manipulation. That's the evidentiary piece that establishes how the cover architecture was constructed and replicated across installations. My documentation becomes part of a federal prosecution," Claire said. "Your documentation is the spine of a federal prosecution," Kettridge said. "Along with your testimony," she set the coffee down, "and the reinstatement assessment. That's a separate conversation, related but separate." He looked at her steadily. "That's your choice, Claire, not ours." She looked at the conference table, at the filed spread across it, the photographs, the organizational charts with names and lines connecting them, the specific architecture of something corrupt and large that had been running for 30 months, and had been moving supplies intended for wounded soldiers into a private distribution network for profit. She thought about the soldiers at Harlow Ridge who had come through the trauma bay in the past 14 months and what it meant that the resources meant for their care had been systematically diverted. She thought about the other 10 installations, the other versions of the same calculation being made at other people's expense. She thought about 14 months of arriving early and leaving late and eating sandwiches at her desk and being called a paperwork nurse by a man who'd been pre-selected and pointed at her like a tool. She thought about what she'd said to Holt in the corridor, "I know what I'm doing and why." That was enough. She looked at Kettridge. What's the timeline on prosecution? Federal grand jury convenes in 6 weeks. Ashford, Voss, Stolk, and Yarrow face charges at Harlow Ridge. The broader network charges follow once the complete evidentiary package is assembled. We estimate 90 to 120 days. And the person at the top, federal charges, multiple counts. The chain holds, and based on what you built, it holds we're looking at a minimum of 15 years on the supply diversion alone. Before we add the obstruction, the fraudulent documentation, and the conspiracy charges that connect the installations. Minimum 15 years. Claire held that number for a moment, not with satisfaction exactly. It wasn't a satisfying feeling. It was a correct one, and then she nodded and picked up her coffee again. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. She stayed in Denver for 3 days. She gave formal recorded testimony in a structured interview format that took most of the first day, covering every evidentiary step of the Harlow Ridge investigation in the precise chronological sequence she'd built it, cross-referenced with the photographic documentation she'd compiled on her personal devices. 2 analysts asked her to walk through the divergence between the digital access logs and the physical backup records 4 separate times from 4 different angles, because that piece of the architecture was the one that would be challenged most aggressively in court, and they needed the explanation to be airtight from multiple approaches. It was. She knew it was before they asked, because she'd built it knowing that at some point it would need to survive a defense attorney's sustained attention, and she had constructed it accordingly. On the second day, she sat with a federal attorney named Cassandra Webb, who was direct and unsentimental and thorough in exactly the way Claire needed a federal attorney to be, and they went through the formal process of establishing Claire's evidentiary chain of custody. For every piece of documentation she'd collected, every photograph, every notebook entry, and the specific circumstances under which each had been obtained. Webb asked hard questions, and Claire answered them without dressing anything up, including the parts where her methods existed in gray areas, the monitoring notification she'd set up on the secondary pharmaceutical storage access logs, the communication channel she'd used to relay information to Kettridge's office, the conversation with Okonkwo in which she'd disclosed her prior service record. "You want to know if any of this creates a suppression problem," Claire said. "I want to know all of it," Webb said, "so I can determine whether any of it creates a suppression problem." The monitoring notification was built using technical knowledge I developed during a classified operational period and applied to a system I had legitimate access to as a supply staff member. The alert it generated was based on publicly accessible access log data, not on any system intrusion. Webb looked at her notes and the communication channel. Registered protocol, routed to a legitimate federal contact. She paused. Cleaner than it sounds. Webb looked up from her notes. "Most of this is cleaner than I expected," she said, which, from a federal attorney, was as close to a compliment as the process allowed. On the third morning, Claire met with Kettridge alone, in a smaller room with no analysts and no recording equipment, and a window that faced the Rocky Mountain Front Range, brown and massive in the winter light. He slid a document across the table. She read it. Full reinstatement. Active operational classification restored. Posting options listed as 3, 2 domestic, 1 international. The domestic options included a senior advisory role with the Investigative Coordination Office and a field position that had a description vague enough to tell her exactly what it was. She read the document twice. She set it down. "What happened to the posting I left?" she said. Kettridge's expression shifted by a small amount. "The incident that prompted your administrative separation was reviewed as part of a broader records audit 18 months ago. The review concluded that the separation was procedurally flawed and that the documentation underlying it had been selectively presented." He paused. "That finding has been sitting in a queue, waiting for your operational clearance to be re-established." She looked at the window. The mountains were doing what they always did, sitting there, indifferent, large in the way that things are large when they have existed for a long time and will continue to regardless. Someone buried the review finding until I was useful again, she said. That's one way to characterize it. Is there another way? He was quiet for a moment. The finding required an active clearance to action. You didn't have one. The clearance required an active operational record. You didn't have one of those either. The separation created a loop that couldn't be closed from the outside. He met her eyes. Harlow Ridge closed the loop. She thought about whether that was a justification or an explanation and decided the distinction didn't matter enough to argue about right now. What mattered was the document in front of her and the three options listed in it, and the decision that she was the only person in this room authorized to make. She thought about the nursing station at Harlow Ridge and Diane Marsh's face and the staff who'd migrated there in the afternoon to say something out loud that she hadn't known she needed to hear until she was hearing it. She thought about Stoke in the relay station with a battery-powered lamp and a stalled file transfer. She thought about Ashford's face in the corridor for a fraction of a second too long. She thought about what the work had been for 14 months and what it had cost and what it had produced, and whether the quiet and the isolation and the food tray at 715 in a room full of witnesses added up to something she would choose again if she'd known from the beginning what it would require. She would. That was the honest answer. She would choose it again. I need a week, she said. You have 2, Kettridge said. She picked up the document, folded it once, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. Then she stood up and shook his hand again, and took the elevator down to the parking level and drove north on I-25 back toward Wyoming in the early morning light. Harlow Ridge Military Medical Center held a formal command recognition ceremony 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning in the main assembly halls, which seated 200 and was full. The new base commander, a colonel named Adrian Moss, who had been brought in from the Pacific Northwest on 30 days' notice to stabilize the facility's command structure, had organized the ceremony with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that what an institution needs after a corruption scandal is not distance from what happened, but an honest accounting of it. She had reviewed the full CID case file. She had read every piece of documentation Claire had compiled. She had made 3 phone calls to Kettridge's office in Denver before the ceremony to confirm what she intended to say, and Kettridge had confirmed it. Claire was told to be there at 900. She arrived at 854, which was her, and she sat in the front row in her nursing scrubs rather than anything else, because the scrubs were what she wore to do the job, and the job was what this was about. Diane Marsh was 2 seats to her left. Holt was in the 3rd row in full dress uniform, which he was wearing with the particular straightness of someone who is using posture to say something he hasn't fully put into words yet. Colonel Moss stood at the podium and spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She talked about what had been found at Harlow Ridge and what it had cost the patients and staff who'd been working inside a system that was being quietly hollowed out from the inside. She talked about the 22 months of operation, the value of the diverted supplies, the 4 arrests, and the federal prosecution that was now formally underway. She talked about it plainly and without the softening language that institutions default to when they're discussing their own failures, which was unusual enough that it created a specific quality of attention in the room. Then she talked about Claire. She did not describe her as a hero, which Claire would have found uncomfortable, and she did not use the language of the inspirational summary, which would have been worse. She described what Claire had done in procedural terms, the discrepancies identified, the documentation built, the timeline sustained, the pressure applied, and the response to it. And she let the procedural description carry the weight because the weight was in the facts, and the facts were sufficient. She talked about what it meant that a woman had arrived at a military medical installation and done her job so completely and so carefully that a 22-month criminal operation had been unable to outlast her patients. She talked about the conduct review. She talked about the transfer offer. She talked about a cafeteria at 715 on a Tuesday morning. The room was very quiet. Then Moss said, Sergeant First Class Marcus Holt has requested the opportunity to make a statement. Holt stood. He came to the front of the room with his dress uniform exactly right, and his expression carrying the specific gravity of a man who has spent 3 weeks deciding how to say something correctly and is now discovering that there is no version of it that feels adequate. He stood at the front of the room and looked at Claire directly. "I was given a story about you," he said. "I believed it because it was convenient to believe it, and because I didn't look hard enough at the source. I used my rank to make your job harder in a facility where you were already fighting on multiple fronts. I did that in front of witnesses, and I did worse than that in a cafeteria one Tuesday morning, in front of 50 people who are mostly in this room right now." He paused. "I was wrong. That's not a complicated statement, and I'm not going to make it complicated. I was wrong about who you were, and I was wrong about what I did. And those are two separate wrongs, and they both belong to me." He didn't look at the audience. He kept looking at Claire. "I don't know if I would have had the discipline to do what you did," he said. "Working every day in a place that was trying to move you out, building evidence that no one around you could see, staying steady when every institutional signal was telling you to leave. I've been in hard situations. I've never been in one that required that specific kind of patience." He stopped. He needed to say that out loud. In front of everyone. He returned to his seat. Colonel Moss said, "Nurse Claire Novak." Claire stood and walked to the front of the room and turned and faced 200 people she had worked alongside for 14 months, most of whom had never looked at her twice, stood in front of them in her nursing scrubs without ceremony or performance, and said what she had to say in the way she said everything, which was without wasted language. "I did my job," she said. "That's the first thing. Everything I did at this installation was the job, the supply counts, the documentation, the reports that some people found inconvenient. The job didn't change because it was being made difficult. Still the job." She looked at the room. "The second thing is that I want to be honest about what it cost. Not because I want recognition for it, but because I think it matters to say it plainly. 14 months is a long time to work inside a place that is actively organized against you. There were days when the isolation was heavy and the distance between what I knew and what I could prove felt like it was getting wider instead of narrower. There were days when leaving would have been the easier choice, and the easier choice had a real pull to it." She paused. "I stayed because the work was real. The patients were real. Problem was real. Leaving because someone wanted me gone would have meant the problem continued. And I could not make my peace with that." The room was still. "I want to say something to every person in here who has ever been dismissed before they were understood, who has been pushed aside by someone who assumed they knew what you were made of without looking, who has had the thing they were trying to protect treated as an inconvenience by the people who should have been protecting it alongside them." She looked at the room, row by row, unhurried. "You do not have to be loud to be right. You do not have to fight on their terms, or in their time frame, or by their rules. The work you do quietly, carefully, and completely is real, even when nobody is watching it, especially when nobody is watching it. The truth does not require an audience to be true. It only requires someone patient enough to keep building the record." She stopped. "Stay in the room," she said. "Stay in the room when they want you out of it. Not out of stubbornness, and not to prove something, and not because you're trying to win. Stay, because the work needs doing, and you are the person who knows how to do it. That's enough. That has always been enough." She walked back to her seat. The applause in the room was not the polite kind, not the socially obligatory sound of an audience responding to a cue. It was the kind that comes from 200 people who have been sitting with something they needed to hear, named out loud, and are now releasing the weight of it. And it went on for longer than formal ceremonies usually allowed, and Colonel Moss let it run. Formal outcomes arrived in stages over the following weeks, reported through official channels and covered in the military press in language that was precise and institutional, but that could not fully contain what it was describing. Colonel Reginald Ashford was charged federally with conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and theft of government property, 7 counts total. His arraignment drew no supporters. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that the evidence directly contradicted. Plea was later changed. He faced a sentencing recommendation that began at 12 years and moved upward from there as additional charges from the network investigation were added to his file. Patricia Voss was charged with conspiracy, evidence tampering, and obstruction, 5 counts. Cooperated partially in exchange for a reduced recommendation and received a sentence of 6 years, which her attorney described as disproportionate and which the federal judge declined to adjust. She lost her administrative license permanently. She would not work in a military or government institution again. Kremen Stolk, whose cooperation had provided the critical secondary recipient list, received a reduced charge arrangement, 3 counts instead of 6, and a sentencing recommendation of 4 years. Surrendered his medical license voluntarily before the formal revocation proceeding could begin, which his attorney characterized as accepting responsibility and which most people who'd worked alongside him at Harlow Ridge characterized differently. He would not practice medicine again. Tom Yarrow, whose cooperation had started the day he'd been reached on a state highway heading south and had continued comprehensively. From that point, received the most favorable outcome of the 4-2 counts. Sentencing recommendation of 18 months, eligibility for early release contingent on continued cooperation investigation with the broader network investigation. He was 29 years old. He would carry this forward. The broader network investigation produced federal charges against 9 additional individuals across 7 installations. Person at the top of the structure, the name Kettridge had held for 8 months, was arrested at a private address in Northern Virginia on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after Claire's testimony in Denver. Federal charges: conspiracy, racketeering, theft of government property, and obstruction of justice. 41 counts across 11 installations and 30 months of operation. The arrest was reported in 3 sentences in the morning briefing of 2 national outlets, and in considerably more detail in every military medical community that had been living inside what this person had built. $11 million, 30 months, 11 installations, 41 counts. The record Claire had built at Harlow Ridge was the evidentiary spine that held the prosecution together, as Kettridge had said it would be. Webb used it in the grand jury proceedings with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they had and what it could carry. The chain of custody was unimpeachable. The methodology was documented completely. The cross-reference between the digital access manipulation and the physical backup logs, the piece the defense attacked most aggressively in preliminary motions, survived every challenge. Because Claire had built it knowing it would be challenged and had made it out of something that couldn't be taken apart. On a Friday in late April, 6 weeks after the ceremony, Claire drove to Harlow Ridge for the last time as a staff member. She had made her decision during the second of the 2 weeks Kettridge had given her, sitting at her kitchen table with the folded document in front of her and the dry erase board behind her, the timeline still partly visible beneath the half-erased surface. She had chosen the field position, not the advisory role, not the international posting, but the specific, difficult, ongoing work of being inside institutions that needed someone with her particular combination of access and training and patience. There were 11 installations that had been compromised. There were audits to run and systems to rebuild, and the quiet, unglamorous work of making sure the architecture of the next operation couldn't take root in the same soil this one had used. It was the job. The job was real. She knew how to do it. Cleared her locker in 20 minutes. She returned her keycard to the nursing station and signed the separation form that Diane Marsh had prepared, and Diane had done the professional thing, which was to keep it practical and not cry, until Claire was already in the hallway, which Claire appreciated without acknowledging, because there are some kindnesses that only work if you pretend not to see them. She stopped at the supply room. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it, the shelving she'd organized in her first week, the color-coded labels, the physical log system she'd implemented that had become standard protocol after the investigation, the bottom drawer where a plain black notebook had lived for 11 weeks and had started something that ended in a Northern Virginia arrest and 41 federal counts. The room looked like a supply room. It was exactly what it appeared to be, and it had also been, for 14 months, a place where quiet and patient and unglamorous work had accumulated into something that mattered. She thought about that. Then she thought about the person who came next, whoever would stand in this doorway eventually and inherit the color-coded labels and the physical log protocol, and whether they would understand that the system they were stepping into had been built by someone who had been told repeatedly and in multiple institutional registers that she was a problem, a friction point, an inconvenience that would resolve itself if enough pressure was applied. She hoped they would take care of it. She turned and walked down the corridor and out through the staff entrance into the April morning, which was cold but differently, cold from winter, a cold with light in it, kind that meant the season had turned, even if the temperature hadn't fully agreed yet. The mountains to the west were showing snow on the upper elevations and brown-gray on the slopes below, and the plains stretched away from the base in every direction with the particular flatness that had struck her as austere when she'd arrived, and that she'd come to find simply honest. Put her bag in her car. She stood beside it for a moment in the parking lot. Her phone showed a message from a number she now had saved. Oh, Conquo. Denver confirmed your start date. Welcome back. She looked at the message. She looked at the base at the concrete buildings and the chain link fence and the main access road running straight and flat toward the highway. She looked at it the way you look at a place that has asked something significant of you and has given something significant back, the specific transaction that some places make with the people who go through them, and that can't be quantified in any personnel file. She had come here as someone whose name had been administratively erased. She was leaving as someone whose name was now inside a federal prosecution, a recognition ceremony, a formal reinstatement document, and more quietly, but no less real, the institutional memory of everyone who had been in that nursing station on a Thursday afternoon in March, when Diane Marsh had said out loud what it had cost and what it had been worth. The biggest mistake they made was assuming that a quiet person has nothing to say. The second biggest was assuming that patience is the same thing as passivity. She got in the car. She pulled out of the parking lot. She drove south toward the highway without looking in the rearview mirror, not because she was leaving something behind, but because she was already thinking about what came next, which had always been how she moved forward, present, carrying what was useful and letting the rest stay where it belonged. The mountains sat to the west as she drove, doing what they always did. She drove into the morning with both hands steady on the wheel, heading toward the work. That had always been enough. It was still enough now.